I was 21 years old and I was backpacking around the United States. I was in New Orleans and staying in a wonderfully bohemian youth hostel called the India House, which is actually still all running, as I can tell on Google Maps, which is nice to know. Recommend it, lovely place, especially if you're a young adult. And there was a guy there who had arranged to sell me some magic mushrooms. But when I went to him, he had failed in his quest to get me mushrooms, but instead said that he had some LSD. I had read a lot about LSD, and I knew that it could cause profound experiences, and I knew that there was a lot of research indicating that LSD could be quite good for people and help them to gain a deeper understanding of who they are and what reality is. And ultimately, as someone interested in philosophy, I was on, I suppose, a personal quest to understand those two things, who I am and what this is, what reality really is. And so this guy offered to sell me some LSD, and so I bought some off him. And he said, as he sold them to me, he said, this chap, he had a bullet wound through his chest from when he was mugged. I mean, you don't meet guys like this in America, but he said, dude, this is some strong shit. So just do one tab and save the others for another time, man. Strong shit. Save the others for another time. I didn't. I took them all. And in retrospect, I would estimate the dosage to be 800 micrograms to 1,000 micrograms. For those of you who are not familiar with this, that's a pretty big dose. It's a pretty strong dose, especially for essentially a first experience on it. Most people start with a dose around 100 micrograms or less. So it was a big dose. And now it kicked in when I was outside in the swimming pool. This hostel India House had a kind of rather unextravagant swimming pool, which everyone enjoyed in the summer sun of the Louisiana heat. And I remember the moment it kicked in. I felt the shiver up my spine, a really unusual, strong, rising up. And I looked at the guy and he said, oh yeah, that's normal. I said, okay. And I made this motion in the water with my hand, and I was mesmerized by the spirals and swirling of the water, which was revealed to have the most infinite and complex beauty. It was profound immediately, actually, the beauty of the experience. But this is all very superficial at this point, and as the trip progressed, it really became more and more profound and really took me to some very deep places. I think when one does LSD, it feels a bit like one is using one's eyes for the first time again. There is a very strong sense that actually, we've always been on a trip. It had never really been anything other than a trip. It had never been anything other than an experience, a flow of experiences. That's what life is, and over time we come to think that it's something that it's not. We think it's somehow more real and solid than it really is, when actually it is nothing other than a trip, this life of ours. And LSD kind of resets the mind, I suppose, so that we can see that again and see not the unreality of it per se, just that it's not quite as real and solid as we think that it is. Now, enough of these abstract explanations. Let me tell you what I experienced. And I'm very much aware that listening to people tell you about their dreams and about their trips and drug experiences is often rather boring, but this, I believe, potentially has profound implications for all of us, what I saw, potentially. And I will start with a proviso that I do not believe that what I experienced is necessarily real, or in philosophy we use the word veridical, which means truth-bearing. So It's very difficult to say whether experiences on drugs are real or unreal, veridical or unveridical. All we can say is that we experienced them, and I will do my best to describe what I experienced on what could only be described as a wholly transcendent experience that felt incredibly real. It felt spiritual and of perhaps profound sacred or religious significance, and that's how it felt. I can't say that it's true or false, real or unreal, but that is how what unfolded felt, and I will never forget it. It was the peak of my experience as a human being so far. I suppose the process began by an unfolding of experiences whereby everything felt like smoke all of a sudden. Experience drifts, and indeed in Ecclesiastes it does say in one translation of the first bit of it, smoke, smoke, all is smoke. Everything we do and see is actually somehow illusory, and this is an idea that recurs in many Eastern traditions, especially Hinduism, and perhaps to a lesser extent Buddhism as well. This idea of maya, of illusion, a illusory world that we can perhaps transcend or escape, and transcend and escape I temporarily did. It felt as if I took a step backwards. It's the only way to put it. It is as if my whole life up until that point was simply smoke on a cinema screen, let's say, a kind of projection, an unreality, like virtual reality, essentially, a screen in front of me. And I had been sat in front of this screen for what I intuitively felt to be a profoundly long duration of time, an eternity. It is as if, in fact, we never really move. We just have an experience of movement in front of us. But the actual subject who perceives this mind, who perceives the world, this representation of the world, doesn't really move. And so I took this step back from this bubble of experience, this cinema screen, and I entered a boundless space, a space without limit, in which experience occurs, the space in which experience occurs, and was rather reminiscent of, Neo unplugging from the Matrix. Once he is unplugged from the virtual reality, he wakes up and he sees the real world, or what felt like the real world, and he could see the other people in their pods, unaware of this reality in which they actually lived. How to describe it? It really was as if the people, there were points of light, like stars shining, and they were in circles that were layered above and beneath one another, like a kind of colosseum that went downwards endlessly, these points of light, circles, concentric circles of points of light, and each of these points of light I knew to be a sentient being, much like myself, perhaps in a way identical to myself. And each of these points of light seemed to be within their own bubble. Isn't that so? You and I, we live our lives each in our own bubbles. We have experiences of the five senses which create a representation of the world that we perceive, and in a strange kind of way we're kind of trapped behind these representations, behind the veil of perception, as I think it was Locke who called it. These bubbles of experience, each of us in our own cinema, if you will, but we kind of forget that we're in it. We forget that it's the Matrix, if you will, and that we can potentially take this step back. Now, when I looked upwards, and incidentally, I wasn't so far from the top myself, which was, I suppose, reassuring. When I looked upwards, I could see points of light, beings, who had seemingly permanently extricated themselves from this system. They had left their bubbles, and they seemed to permanently reside in this other world, this transcendent realm, this subtle, boundless space in which all sentient beings are actually always dwelling, unmoving, merely experiencing the illusion of movement in a world that is really somehow fundamentally illusory, unreal, virtual, perhaps. I know it's a big thing lately, this simulation theory. It's not just a fun idea, perhaps it really is so. And when you have an experience like that, you can't unexperience it. You can question it, and I'll never know if it was veridical or not, but I did experience it. That's what I experienced, and what more can you say? These perfect beings who had extricated themselves from the world of smoke seemed delighted that I could see them. It's hard to describe. They had no face, they had no lips to move, but there was some communication, it felt, between us, me and these perfect ones. They were very pleased that I could see them, and expressed a boundless love, endless love, and I suppose compassion for those lost in the boxes of smoke. When I looked upwards, there was a being in the centre of the circle of these other perfect beings. And to my mind, that being appeared as a Buddha, a fairly typical, stereotypical Buddha. And obviously, being a critical thinker of sorts, I would suggest that this implies a kind of mediation of my mind. This is some kind of representation of an absolute principle, or perhaps even an absolute aspect of my own consciousness, some archetypal figure or teacher who seemed to be endlessly teaching those perfect beings around him. And he could perceive me, but again his lips did not move, though he seemed to communicate with me. He communicated that he was incredibly pleased that I had seen this place, that I had returned to this place, and realized that that's where I actually always was, never leaving it, only confused by the illusions in the bubble of experience. He suggested, however, that it would be better in future if I were to return using the traditional means, which I took to mean meditation, some kind of esoteric meditation practices that could allow me to return one day. And slowly the experience passed, and I felt myself coming back to the world of smoke, the world of the five senses, the realm of the six sense realms, as one poem describes it. Back into my box I went, and for the most part, for the last 14 years or so, I have remained in my box of smoke, never having an experience like that one again. No matter how much I would meditate, no matter what other drugs I would experiment with, nothing took me close to that. I never did such a big dose of LSD ever again. There was a strong sense that I was playing with fire, perhaps even playing with the very fabric of the soul itself, the consequences of which I could never hope to predict or fully understand. Perhaps a dangerous game. I felt deeply honoured to have had that experience. It felt sacred. It felt very real, whether or not it actually was sacred or real. Nobody can judge, not even myself. I have experimented with DMT, and DMT produces quite different experiences, which are also seemingly transcendental, but my intuition tells me that those experiences are simply changing the smoke on the screen and not necessarily producing a transcendental, a kind of transcendence as real as the one that I experienced on that day. I wasn't really the same after that experience. I continued to drift around America, and I suppose I was more sensitive as a mind. Every now and again I would catch a glimpse of some ineffable beauty in the movement of things. After that, I could also really tell anyone who had done LSD in the past. It's a bit of a special gift, I suppose, I think I have, that if someone has done a high dose of LSD at some point in their lives, I will be able to sense it very quickly, even in the way they walk or the way they talk. There's just something about it that I can pick up on that I would not have known to pick up on before I had done LSD myself. I resolved, as a result of that experience, to, when I got back to the UK, go to a Buddhist monastery to deepen my spiritual practice, as the being I seemed to encounter advised that I should. However, the result of that process was quite unexpected, I suppose. In Zen Buddhism, they have a saying that if you see the Buddha in the road, mow him down, run him over. Zen Buddhism advocates, I suppose, a deep distrust of spiritual experience and mystical experience in a way. Certainly it tells us that we should not formulate views and beliefs based on such experiences and then get overly attached to them. Labeling them as real and unreal is largely just another game of the mind. After all, it's something that we put on experiences that we have, whether they are more mundane experiences or whether they are profoundly transcendental spiritual ones. It's good, I think, to have a healthy detachment from the beliefs that such experiences might lead us to cling to. Experiences which have their own emotional payoffs that perhaps corrupt our equanimity in the pursuit of truth. Once upon a time I told a Zen monk about that experience, a very wise woman, Reverend Master Olwyn. She simply said to me, yes, but will it help you to sweep the floor? Zen Buddhism is big on this idea of ordinary enlightenment. The idea that, as Zen Master Dogen said, to be enlightened is to live an ordinary daily life. To be enlightened does not necessarily mean hanging out with giant glowing Buddhas in transcendental realms of experience, as pleasant and profound as they may feel, and as real or unreal as they may be, who knows. It does raise a question as to what the goal of a spiritual journey really is. Is the goal to transcend the box of smoke and float about in the transcendental realms for eternity? Is it important whether at the moment one has that experience or this experience, or is it simply important that we fully and wholeheartedly accept the experience of the present moment? I'm reminded a bit of Cypher in The Matrix, who chooses to go back into the Matrix so that he can enjoy the experiences. And this is an interesting moral question, I suppose anyone who has such experiences might reflect on, whether it's good to be like Cypher or not. One thing I came to learn, however, is that in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the monks take what's called a bodhisattva vow, which implies that even if one were to transcend the world and leave the matrix and the boxes of smoke, one has a kind of moral duty, perhaps, to return to the world to help liberate other people. An interesting possibility. I can't claim to be on such a path because I still have not fully mastered the ways in which we can transcend the matrix and unplug and leave the cinema screen and the boxes of smoke and permanently reside in these transcendental realms. I suppose. I wonder if I should keep looking or not, if that really is the goal, because Zen Buddhism and the very wise people I've met in the Buddhist community, in the Zen Buddhist community at least, suggest, based on this principle of non-dualism, that actually that really isn't the goal. It's not actually about pushing away the world of the senses, but fully accepting the 6 sense realms is said by great masters to be the same as true enlightenment. And I suppose in Buddhism there's a huge emphasis on removing desire, on removing craving. And one of the great dangers of these experiences that we can have is that we spend our whole lives chasing them, trying to get back. And in doing so, we miss out on the perfection of the present moment that we could experience by, with good faith and wholehearted intention, fully accepting what is given to us in the moment, whether it be real or unreal. Best not to even label it. This is a bit of a game, as I said. I'm beginning to ramble and repeat myself, so I'll stop this video now, but that experience changed me permanently. It showed me possibilities, metaphysical possibilities, that whilst I could have read them in a book, I could never really have understood until I had had that. If nothing else, the psychedelic experience shows us the sheer flexibility of the mind in terms of the phenomenal experiences that it can play host to. I would also add, as a final thought, that my reflections on the afterlife, on what happens after this life ends, were permanently changed a little bit. I could suddenly see how when one life ends, the next program is loaded, the next film projected onto the cinema screen, and again I had had that sense of having been in that cinema, that bubble, for an immeasurably long time, and having been through many lifetimes already. So, whilst I do not cling to the view of reincarnation, the belief in reincarnation, and I'm deeply wary of people who claim to know the answers as to what happens when our bodies cease to function, certainly the new perspective I gleaned from that experience allowed me to see how reincarnation might work, the kind of mechanics of it, if you will, the possibility that prior I could never really have gotten my head around. It was just an academic possibility in a list of other unknowable academic possibilities in answering this question of the afterlife. So, thank you for listening to this account and lending me your ears. I wonder what you think of it, whether you think it was just a hallucination and completely unreal, or whether you think that perhaps I temporarily died. I temporarily unplugged from the matrix, or peered through the veil of illusion and saw the absolute true reality of things. I am not committed to either view, so don't think you'll trigger or offend me if you say you're just some idiot who hallucinated on an unsafe dose of LSD. You may well be right, but that is what I experienced during that process, during that time. Thank you for listening. Thank you, India House, to being such a wonderful host when I tripped my balls off. And thank you, strange man with a bullet wound through his chest, who sold me this incredibly powerful and beautiful substance known as LSD.